I went to my son's house to look after his mother-in-law, a woman whom doctors had concluded was in a deep coma after an accident. They said she had no awareness, could not hear, could not feel, did not know anything anymore. I believed that until the moment the front door closed behind them. When I bent down to straighten the blanket on the bed, the woman opened her eyes, not dazed, not panicked. She looked straight at me and whispered softly, "Finally, they've left." I stood frozen. In the room filled with medical equipment and the steady beeping sounds, I suddenly understood that something was very wrong, and that if I reacted too quickly, I might turn myself into part of that wrongness. If you've ever believed that living kindly is enough, this story is for you. Stay until the end to see how justice arrives, not through anger, but through clarity. Don't forget to subscribe and share so we can protect these values together. I am 63 years old. At this age, people usually stop hoping for anything grand. I live alone in a small house on the edge of town, tending a few potted plants on the porch, waking early to brew tea, and spending afternoons reading or walking around the neighborhood. My life is not abundant, but it is peaceful. I have always believed in something straightforward. Be kind. There is no need to calculate too much. What comes will find its way. Maybe not immediately, but it will come. I don't give this belief any lofty name. It is simply how I live and how I keep my heart from becoming too heavy. Last week, my son called. His voice sounded rushed, but still carried his familiar politeness. "Mom, I need your help with something." I could hear my daughter-in-law, Julia, in the background. She was crying, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Mark said that Julia's mother, Ruth, had been in a car accident, a head injury. The doctors said she was in a deep coma. They had brought her home for care because her condition was stable but required constant monitoring. Mark and Julia had to fly to another state for urgent work for a few days and couldn't leave Ruth alone. "Could you come stay for a few days? Just so there's someone in the house. A nurse will come twice a day." I didn't ask many questions. I didn't weigh the pros and cons. I felt a quiet yes inside myself. Helping someone at their weakest has always felt like the right thing to do, not out of duty, not because anyone would owe me. I believe helping others is planting a good seed. Where that seed goes, or how it returns, I don't need to know. Doing the right thing at the right time is enough. The next morning, I brought a small bag and went to Mark's house. It was large and new, but it felt cold. Julia opened the door with red, swollen eyes, holding my hand and thanking me repeatedly. Mark stood behind her, checking his watch, reminding me about the nurse's schedule and that the medications were in the kitchen. They led me to the living room where Ruth was staying. A medical bed stood in the center. Machines beeped steadily. The woman lying there was thin and pale, her gray hair neatly brushed. She looked as though she were in a profound sleep, completely unresponsive. Julia stood by the bed and whispered that the doctors said Ruth had no awareness anymore. It might stay that way for a long time. 3 hours later, Mark and Julia left. I stood in the hallway listening to the door close, the wheels of the suitcase rolling farther away. The large house became strangely quiet. I returned to Ruth's room, pulled up a chair, and sat beside the bed. I didn't speak. Sometimes being near someone requires no words at all. I reached out to straighten the blanket, which had shifted slightly to one side. When my fingertips lightly touched her forehead, it happened. Her eyes opened. Not slowly, not hazily. They opened clearly. Alert eyes looking straight at me. I froze, my heart nearly stopping. Ruth looked at me for a moment, then spoke. Her voice very soft but unmistakably clear. Finally, they've left. My entire body went cold. After saying that, Ruth closed her eyes immediately, as if she had never opened them at all. I sat still for a long time, not moving. Hundreds of questions filled my mind, but I didn't ask a single one. I have lived long enough to know that reacting too quickly often only makes things more tangled. I looked around the room. Everything was the same. The machines continued their steady beeping. The lights didn't change. There was no sign that what had just happened was unusual. Yet inside me, there was a very faint feeling, thin and taut, like a stretched thread, not clear, but enough to demand attention. Mark's house was spacious and beautiful, but it wasn't warm, not because it lacked furniture, but because everything was arranged too perfectly, too precisely. Everything was in its place. Nothing extra, nothing missing, more like a place, more, on display than a place meant for living. I went to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. While the water was boiling, I noticed the medication bottles lined up neatly on a shelf, clearly labeled, the handwriting careful. Some things had been prepared very thoroughly, so thoroughly that they seemed to discourage anyone else from touching them. I thought back to that morning. Mark was still my son. Mark, polite, proper, never raising his voice, never irritable. But between mother and son, there was a distance that hadn't existed before. He spoke to me the way one speaks to a respected acquaintance, not to his mother. No unnecessary words, no lack of courtesy, just no warmth. I didn't blame him. Children grow up, start families of their own, and live in their own ways. I had learned not to hold on to my child with emotion. Julia was different. She spoke more, asked about everything, reminded me to rest and eat on time. Every word was correct, reasonable. But when I looked into her eyes, I noticed a strange intensity, as if she were always watching what I was doing, what I touched, where I stood in the house. I didn't think badly of her. I reminded myself of that. People who have recently gone through a serious experience can become more controlling than usual. That isn't uncommon. I carried my tea back to Ruth's room. She lay still, her face calm, like someone sleeping. If I hadn't seen her eyes open with my own eyes, I would have believed she knew nothing of the world around her. I sat down again, resting my hands on my knees. I didn't touch her anymore, not out of fear, but because I wanted to observe. I believed that if something needed to be said, it would find its own way to be said. I've always believed that. Everything has its reason. Some truths don't arrive with loud noise, but with minimal signs. My task isn't to drag them into the light too quickly, but not to turn away when they stand before me. I sat there listening to the steady machines, listening also to the silence of the house. The air wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either, like a calm surface of water hiding a current underneath. Inside me, there was no conclusion, only a tranquil reminder. Don't rush to think badly of anyone, but don't close your eyes either. I finished my tea, stood up to check the windows and curtains, then returned to the chair. If this were merely a misunderstanding, it would soon reveal itself. And if not, I trusted that the truth does not like to be ignored for too long. I chose to remain still, not out of fear, but because I believe there are moments when silence is the way to keep oneself from going down the wrong path. I don't know how long I sat there. I only know that the room did not change at all, while something inside me quietly opened, like a door just barely ajar. I remained silent. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that if something needed to be said, it would require enough stillness to step forward on its own. After a while, Ruth opened her eyes again, this time, more slowly. Her gaze was unhurried, unafraid. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then turned to look at me, like someone waking from a long sleep, fully aware of where she was. "Please don't call anyone," she said, "at least not right now." Her voice was hoarse but clear, not the voice of someone confused or drifting. I felt my skin prickle, but I didn't stand up, didn't cry out. I simply nodded very slightly, a way of saying that I was listening. She took a deep breath, then spoke slowly, one sentence at a time, as if she had prepared these words long ago. "I'm not in a coma, at least not the way they say." I looked at her without blinking. Part of me wanted to object, to say that the doctors had said otherwise. However, that part was quickly set aside. I had chosen to listen. "They inject me with medication," she continued, "every day, some days twice. Not the medicine, I need." She paused, as if to gather her strength. I stood up and poured her a small sip of water, helping her drink little by little. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was obvious. "They make me sleep deeply right before the nurse comes," she said. "And when everyone leaves, I wake up." I set the cup down and sat back in the chair. My heart was pounding. Everything in my mind was rearranging itself, but I didn't rush to assemble it into conclusions. I had learned that when the truth begins to surface, the most important thing is not to react, but to remain calm and refrain from interrupting. "The doctors said you have no awareness," I said, my voice lower than usual. "They said you can't perceive anything." Ruth smiled faintly, a sad smile without bitterness. "They believe that because that's what they've been told," she said, "and because they don't see me when I'm awake." I didn't ask for anything more. I waited. "They want everyone to believe I've lost consciousness," she continued, "because when people believe that, they stop asking me questions." A silence fell. I could clearly hear the breathing machine. I could hear my own heartbeat. In that moment, I realized I was standing before a very fragile boundary. On one side was the familiar safety of what others had already confirmed. On the other hand was the voice of the woman lying before me, weak but lucid. I chose not to step forward too quickly. "Do you remember everything?" I asked. "I mean, during this time." "Not always clearly," she replied. "Sometimes I'm hazy, sometimes I'm very alert, but enough to understand that they don't want me to speak." She turned her head toward the door, as if afraid someone might be standing outside, but the hallway was empty. "I tried to tell the nurse," she said softly, "but I'm never awake at the right time, and when I try to move, they give me more injections." I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't let anger rise. I reminded myself that if I let emotion lead me now, I wouldn't be able to help anyone. "I don't know who you are," Ruth said, looking straight at me, "but I know that if it weren't you today, I wouldn't have dared to open my eyes." I lowered my head, not out of humility, but because I understood what she meant. There are things not everyone is meant to witness, and once you have seen them, you can no longer pretend you haven't. "I won't act hastily," I said, "but I won't pretend I didn't hear you." Ruth let out a long breath, as if she had been holding it for days. "That's enough," she said. "The truth, if heard in quiet, will find its own way forward." I sat back beside the bed without saying anything more. In my mind, one thing had become very clear. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need someone calm enough to stay with them. After that conversation, Ruth didn't open her eyes much anymore. She told me she needed to conserve her strength. I understood. Sometimes speaking itself is a great effort. I helped her drink water, adjusted her pillow, and then sat in the chair beside her, as I had before. But from that moment on, I was no longer just sitting there to watch over her. I began to observe, not in a tense way, just paying a little more attention, like slowing down on a familiar road to notice the stones you've always passed by. Ruth spoke very softly, in short segments when she had enough strength, not rushed, not rambling. Each thing she said felt like a piece being placed gently on a table. She spoke of documents that had been brought for her to sign, at times when she had just woken up and her mind was still foggy. She remembered once asking what they were and being told they were insurance papers, transfer papers, consent forms for treatment. She signed because she trusted them, because she wasn't clear-headed enough to doubt, and because she never imagined that family members would do anything else. Later, I found out, she said, that some of those signatures weren't mine, and there were papers I had never even seen. I listened, my hands resting quietly on my knees. A heavy feeling settled inside me, but it didn't erupt into anger. It felt more like realizing you've been reading the wrong map and need to turn back. She spoke about bank accounts. At first, small withdrawals, then the larger ones. She didn't know the exact amounts. She only knew that there were figures she had never agreed to, yet they were recorded under her name. "They said I had agreed before," she said, "that I just don't remember because of my illness." I closed my eyes briefly, not to avoid it, but to keep myself from drifting too far. I knew that if I let outrage take over, I would stop hearing clearly. Ruth continued, her voice still steady. She spoke about the medication. Injections are not listed in the prescription. Substantial doses were administered at just the right time before the nurse arrived. She said there were moments when she was awake long enough to hear them talking to each other, not whispering, not hiding, because they believed she couldn't hear. "They say everything will be fine," she said. "Just needs more time." Asked very quietly, "Time for what?" She looked at me. Her eyes weren't afraid, just tired. "Until I can't speak anymore." That sentence didn't make me tremble. It made me fall silent. I saw clearly then, not because I was calmer than others, but because something inside me was holding me steady. I believed that once the truth has begun to surface, my task isn't to shout, but not to turn away. When Ruth rested, I stood up and walked around the house, not searching, just looking. Drawers, file cabinets, places I hadn't paid attention to before because I had trusted. I trusted my son. I trusted my daughter-in-law. I trusted that in a family, people didn't do such things. And it was at that moment that I realized my role in this story. I had overlooked minor signs, not because I hadn't seen them, but because I hadn't wanted to see them, because I was attached to the image of my child. I wanted to believe he lived uprightly, that I had raised him well. That belief, when it turned into attachment, had blinded me. I didn't harshly blame myself. There was no use in punishing my own heart. I simply acknowledged it as a lesson that arrived late. That love, when not paired with clarity, can become a very thick curtain. That evening, I sat alone in the kitchen, drinking tea. It was dark outside. The lights in the house were bright, but the space still felt cold. I thought about Mark, about Julia, about the recent check-in calls, about the care that had been arranged a little too meticulously. I didn't conclude that they were bad people. I only understood that fear and greed, when not faced directly, can lead people a very long way. I returned to Ruth's room and sat beside the bed. "I've heard enough to know this isn't a misunderstanding," I said, "but I won't rush." Ruth nodded very slightly, as if that was precisely what she had been waiting for. "Just don't let yourself get swept away," she said. "They rely on other people panicking." I understood, and in that moment I saw one thing clearly. If I let anger lead the way, I would become part of this disorder. But if I kept my mind steady, the truth would have room to stand. I stayed where I was. No grand plans, no thoughts of the ending. I simply told myself, one step at a time. Some things don't need to be fast. They just need to be right. The next morning, the nurse arrived promptly. She checked the machines, measured the readings, carefully recorded everything, and then left. Throughout the entire visit, Ruth lay still, her breathing steady with no sign of awareness. As soon as the door closed behind the nurse, she opened her eyes very slowly and looked at me, as if asking whether everything had passed. I nodded. There was no need for words. After she rested, I went into the living room. Daylight poured through the large glass windows, exposing everything in the house. I looked at the family photos on the wall. Mark and Julia are on their trips, smiles captured at the right angles. Everything looked complete, too complete. I sat down and opened my phone to reread Mark's messages from the past few days, the regular check-ins, the carefully detailed instructions. And suddenly, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. None of those calls was to ask whether I was tired or needed anything. They were checks, to make sure I was still there, still fine, still playing my role. That realization sent a chill down my spine. I returned to Ruth's room and pulled my chair closer. "I think I understand why they asked me to come," I said quietly. Ruth looked at me. Her eyes showed no surprise. They need you here, she said, not to take care of me. I swallowed hard. There are things that, once spoken aloud, permanently change how one sees a relationship. They need an outsider, she continued. Someone trustworthy, someone who won't be suspected. I sat in silence. In my mind, all the pieces began to fall into place. I remembered the way Mark spoke to me, how they emphasized that I only needed to be there, that I didn't have to do much. I remembered Julia's gaze every time I stepped closer to the bed. Not a look of worry, but a look of monitoring. I no longer doubted. The most painful truth was not the existence of a murder plot, but rather the fact that it had been uncovered. The most painful truth was realizing that I had been placed here as part of a larger plan, an unwitting witness. Someone who would later say that Ruth had passed peacefully, that nothing was out of the ordinary. A statement coming from a mother, one that would be very difficult to question. I felt a weight settle in my chest. Not anger, sadness, a deep sadness, but not a sharp one. I gave birth to Mark. I raised him, and now he was using my trust to build a protective shell around himself. I did not resent him. I did not try to excuse him either. I simply looked straight at that truth, like looking at a crack that had existed for a long time, only now becoming visible. If I panic, I said, if I react the wrong way, I'll be helping them. Ruth nodded. That's what they're counting on, she said. They're counting on you not being able to bear it. I understood. If I shouted, if I confronted them, if I let pain make me lose control, everything would collapse in a way that benefited them. I would be seen as an overly anxious older woman. My words would lose their weight. I straightened my back, not out of toughness, but because I needed to keep myself from falling. Then I won't lose control, I said. I won't let myself become a tool. Ruth let out a very soft breath, as if she had finally set down a burden. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. Morality is not only about doing what is right, it is also about not letting fear lead you astray. Clarity at this moment was not coldness. It was the final barrier keeping a person from slipping to the other side. We didn't call it making a plan. At least we didn't say it out loud. We simply sat beside each other after the house had fallen into silence and allowed what needed to be done to reveal itself. Ruth spoke first, very slowly. We don't have much time, she said, but if we do this right, enough will be enough. I nodded. There was no sense of urgency inside me, no desire to defeat anyone. I knew only one thing. If I let anger take the wheel, I would ruin everything. We agreed on one straightforward principle. No action while angry. No decisions when the heart is unsettled. Everything must be calm enough before moving forward. Ruth told me the times when she was usually awake, not fixed, but there was a window after each injection when the medication began to wear off. I memorized it. I didn't write anything down. I was afraid of leaving traces. The first thing I did was observe the paperwork in the house. I didn't rummage. I only opened the drawers I had been told contained medical documents. I photographed what I saw with my phone, page by page, then put everything back exactly where it had been. There were documents in Ruth's name, but the signatures didn't match. One didn't need to be an expert to see that. I had seen her real signature on a few old cards kept in a small drawer in the bedroom. The handwriting was slightly shaky, but it had rhythm. Those other signatures were stiff and rushed. I didn't comment. I simply took note. The medication was harder. All the bottles were clearly labeled, but some weren't on the list the nurse had left. They were stored separately, in less visible places, behind the usual medical supplies. I photographed them, carefully read the names, then put them back exactly where they were. I didn't take anything. I knew that if even one bottle was missing, they would notice immediately. Recording audio was the part I hesitated over the most, not because of the technology, but because of the line within myself. I didn't want to turn into someone who lurked and spied, but Ruth was right. Without evidence, the truth would be nothing more than the account of an older woman lying in a hospital bed. I chose a small, simple device, not hidden too carefully, just enough to capture conversations when they believed no one was listening. Throughout the process, I kept reminding myself of one thing. I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing it because if I didn't, the wrongdoing would continue. And if it continued, more people would be harmed. Not only Ruth, not only me. There were moments when, as I looked at the evidence, slowly taking shape, my heart sank. I thought of Mark, of the days when he was little, running home with scraped knees, crying over the most minor things. I let those memories pass through me. I didn't push them away, but I didn't cling to them either. I understood that if I let old feelings guide me, I would no longer be clear enough to do what needed to be done. That evening, when everything was quiet, I sat beside Ruth again. "We don't need to be fast," I said. "We just need to be right." She looked at me, calmer than I had expected. "I've waited a long time," she said. "A few more days don't frighten me." I felt lighter, not because everything was under control, but because I knew I was moving in the right direction. There were no rallying cries, no vows, just two women, each holding steady to her own part. I continued living in the house as usual, making tea, cooking, cleaning, answering Mark's calls in an even tone, saying that everything was fine. When the nurse came, I stood nearby and asked ordinary questions. I showed no sign that my thoughts were elsewhere. Each time I hung up the phone, I paused for a moment, took a breath, reminded myself that the truth doesn't need my anger to protect it. It only needs me not to sabotage its path. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing for sure. Justice, if it came, would come from what was true. Not from my anger, not from a desire for revenge, but from my ability to remain clear enough not to cross the boundary within myself. They returned late in the afternoon on the third day. I heard the car stop in front of the house, then the door open, and the sound of a suitcase rolling across the tiled floor. Those familiar sounds, once comforting, now felt like signs that a chapter was about to close. I stood in the kitchen, wiped my hands on a towel, and took a slow breath, not to gather courage, but to keep myself from moving faster than necessary. Julia came in first. She smiled, hugged me, asked all the right questions, whether the trip had been tiring, whether I'd been sleeping well, how Ruth was doing. Every question was appropriate, excellently played. But I noticed one thing. As she spoke, her eyes kept flicking toward the sick room, as if checking whether everything was still under control. Mark followed. He set down his suitcase, nodded at me, then glanced at his watch. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked. "Okay," I replied. "Just as you said." I was telling the truth. I had done precisely what they expected, and that was what reassured them. They took turns going into Ruth's room. I stood outside, leaning against the wall, listening as Julia's voice changed when she spoke to her mother, gentler but also lower, like someone speaking to an object that could not respond. "We're back," she said. "Everything will be taken care of soon." There was nothing wrong with those words if you only heard them with your ears, but I heard in them a cold relief, not the relief of someone grateful that a loved one was still alive, but the relief of someone who felt a burden was about to be set down. That evening, we ate together. A quick, simple meal. Mark discussed work and unexpected expenses. Julia chimed in, saying everything would be fine, that it just needed a little more time. I listened, slowly chewing each bite. "Her condition hasn't changed," Mark said, as casually as if discussing the weather. "The doctors say this kind of thing is hard to predict." Julia nodded. "Sometimes it's best to let things take their natural course." I looked at them. I didn't ask what natural meant. I already understood. And I also understood that they believed I understood it differently. Natural to them meant not intervening, not asking further questions, letting what had been arranged continue along its path. The medication and nurse fees this month are a bit high, Mark continued, but it's fine. Everything's manageable. His voice wasn't worried. It was the voice of someone calculating. Julia set her chopsticks down and let out a carefully measured sigh. I'm just afraid that dragging this out will be costly, emotionally and financially. She spoke very softly, but in the quiet kitchen, every word landed clearly. We can't let things get out of hand, Mark replied. Out of hand. I heard those words, and nothing stirred inside me. Perhaps because I was already prepared. I understood that what they feared was not losing their mother. They feared losing control, losing what they were holding on to. They feared scarcity. They feared returning to a state they believed they had already escaped. After dinner, Julia told me I should go to bed early. She said I had been tired for days, that from now on they would handle everything. Her voice was gentle, but it left me no choice. Sleep well tonight, she said. If anything happens, we'll call. You. I nodded. I didn't object. I didn't argue. I didn't ask to stay. In the living room, Mark stopped me. Mom, he said, lowering his voice, how have things been these past few days? I looked into my son's eyes. I didn't see the boy he once was, but I didn't see a monster either. I saw a man who had been led too far by fear. Everything has gone exactly as you said, I replied. I didn't notice anything unusual. He exhaled, visibly relieved. That's good, he said. Don't worry, we know what we're doing. I nodded, not because I believed him, but because I understood that saying anything else at that moment was unnecessary. I went back to my room, closed the door, sat down on the edge of the bed. My heart was beating steadily, not faster, not slower. I realized something very clearly. I didn't need to confront them with words. I didn't need to expose them now. When the mind is calm enough, others will reveal what they are hiding. And tonight they had already said a great deal. I lay down and looked up at the ceiling. In the silence, I could hear a muted conversation from the room across the hall. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but it was enough to know they were talking about time, about next steps. I didn't intervene. I stayed where I was. Sometimes standing still in the right place is the only way for evil to reveal itself. Everything quietly unfolded that same evening. There were no shouts, no dramatic confrontation like in the movies, just a series of events happening at the right time, in the correct order, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Julia prepared Ruth's medication as usual. I stood beside her in the role of a mother-in-law who had been helping out for several days. I didn't ask questions. I didn't comment. I only observed. Mark stood by the doorway, phone in hand, talking while glancing at his watch. I caught fragments of familiar phrases. It's on time. Don't worry, everything's fine. When Julia lifted the syringe, I stepped a little closer to the bed. Wait a moment, I said. My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. Both of them turned to look at me. I'd like to sit here, I continued. I've been beside her these past few days anyway. Julia hesitated for a brief moment. Then she nodded. Perhaps in her mind, I was still just an outsider, someone who didn't understand anything, someone harmless. Ruth opened her eyes, not abruptly, not startled. She looked directly at Julia, then at Mark. That's enough for tonight, she said. Her voice was hoarse but clear. Everything stopped. Julia stepped back. Mark froze. I didn't need to look at them to know how their faces were changing. I could feel the air in the room suddenly thicken. She shouldn't be talking, Julia stammered. She's tired. I'm tired from the medication, Ruth said, not from the illness. I took out my phone and placed it on the table. I didn't hold it up. I didn't display it. I simply set it there. I've recorded it, I said, not just tonight. Mark took a step toward me, then stopped. He looked at me, His eyes filled with both panic and anger. "What are you doing, Mom?" he asked. "You don't understand." "I understand enough to know I shouldn't stay silent anymore," I replied. The doorbell rang. Steady, unhurried, not insistent. Julia turned her head. Before she could say anything, the door opened. 2 people in uniform stepped in, followed by a man in plain clothes holding a folder. "We're here in response to a request that was submitted earlier," the man said calmly. No one resisted. No one ran. Mark sat down in a chair, as if all the strength had drained from him. Julia stood still, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her eyes empty. They asked a few brief questions, looked through the documents, checked the medication, listened to a short segment of a recording. There was no need to hear the rest. It was enough. Mark and Julia were asked to go with them. No handcuffs on the spot, no commotion, just leaving the house in silence. When the door closed, the room fell into a profound silence. I sat down in a chair. The feeling wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfactory either. It was like when a lingering pain is finally diagnosed correctly. Not pleasant, but necessary. Ruth closed her eyes. Her breathing grew steadier. I sat there, my hands resting on my knees, looking around the room. Retribution, if it exists, doesn't arrive as a victory. It arrives as a consequence. When the truth is placed where it belongs, everything rearranges itself. No more words are needed. I didn't feel like I had won against anyone. I only knew that from this moment on, the wrongdoing no longer had space to continue existing, and that was enough. The days that followed passed more slowly than I had expected. There were no more urgent beeping machines, no more regular reminder calls. The house grew quiet in a very different way, not the tense quiet from before, but the kind of quiet that comes when everything is finally stopped in its proper place. Ruth was transferred to another care facility. There were no unclear injections, no watchful eyes. She slept more, but her sleep was deep and steady. When awake, she spoke slowly, sometimes smiling. I visited her once a day, never for long. We didn't need to talk much. Some things, once set down, no longer need to be brought up again. I didn't follow the news about Mark and Julia. I knew there would be investigations, further procedures. However, I didn't dwell on those details. Not because I was avoiding them, but because I understood that my part was finished. Some people asked me if I hated them. I thought about that question for a long time, not to find a graceful answer, but an honest one. I do not harbor hatred, but I also do not forgive in the way people usually mean. I don't try to understand them to feel lighter. I simply choose not to carry them with me anymore. For a long time, I lived with the belief that being a mother meant bearing everything, enduring everything, sacrificing so that one's child could be at peace. I believed that was right, until I realized that this very belief was what made me easiest to be used. Letting go, to me now, is not about overlooking. Letting go is returning each person to their rightful place. Returning responsibility to those who caused the harm. Returning my life to myself. I no longer ask why things happened the way they did. I don't revisit every memory to look for fault. Holding on to those questions would only weigh my heart down further, and I don't need to carry anything more. One afternoon, sitting alone in the old room, I suddenly realized something very clearly. I no longer thought of them with pain or anger. There was only a light emptiness, like when an object that had been placed wrongly for a long time is finally moved away. I said to myself, very softly but decisively, I am no longer carrying them in my heart. When I said those words, I didn't feel loss. I felt lighter. Light, like setting down a role I had held for too long, believing it was necessary, when in truth, it no longer fit. And in that lightness, I understood that peace doesn't come from everything ending well, but from knowing when to set things down and move forward. After that, life returned to its slow, ordinary rhythm. I packed my things and left that house on a sunny morning. There was no one to see me off, no goodbyes. I locked the door, placed the keys in the mailbox as instructed by the authorities, then stood for a moment on the porch. I didn't look back for long, not because it would hurt, but because there was nothing left for me to hold on to. I returned to my small home. The potted plants on the porch were blooming right on schedule. The familiar kitchen still carried the scent of the tea I always make. Nothing significant had changed, yet I felt something very clearly. I had returned to myself more completely than before. Ruth recovered slowly but steadily. When she was able to walk again, she called me. We didn't revisit the past, not out of avoidance, but because we both understood that some things are finished precisely because they no longer need to be mentioned. From time to time, I visited her. We walked slowly around the care center's garden. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, meals, and books we had read. No one spoke of credit. No one recounted what they had done right. Everything was gentle, just as it should be. I no longer tried to hold on to the role of the self-sacrificing mother, nor did I feel the need to prove myself right or anyone else wrong. I learned to live the rest of my life with just enough clarity and with a heart that was no longer heavy. Some mornings, I sit on the porch, sipping hot tea, watching people pass by. I realize that I am no longer waiting for something to happen to feel at peace. That peace has been there all along, since the moment I dared to set down what was never mine to carry. Life did not become more perfect, but it became more real. And for me, that is enough. If you've listened this far, perhaps this story has touched a corner of you. Not to make you judge anyone, nor to make you take sides, only to ask whether, in all that has happened, there is something that makes you want to pause and look back at yourself. Perhaps a relationship, perhaps a silence you've held on to for too long, or a role you are carrying, believing it is necessary, when in truth it may be time to let go. If so, then perhaps this story has done its work. The rest is each person's own path.